You only get one chance to make a first impression. Junior Dos Santos was not expected to have the sort of immediate impact that he did when he stepped in for a hugely difficult debut task against the renowned grappler Fabricio Werdum. JDS was known as a powerful KO artist, sure, but Werdum was in the middle of a run of form that would eventually see him submit the great Fedor Emelianenko. Dos Santos was seemingly just another step towards a Werdum title shot, so when he floored his fellow Brazilian in a matter of seconds, it was clear that the heavyweight division had a new force to be reckoned with. It's rare that you see two future champions collide this early in their career, and though they would rematch twice with JDS winning both on the scorecards, this first meeting will always be remembered as the most important one. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson came into the UFC octagon with a pretty decent level of hype. He had that clean, marketable look, a cool nickname, and an unbeaten record in kickboxing. All he needed to do now was prove that his game could work inside the octagon. Taking on Dan Stipkin was never going to tell us much about this guy's title potential, but early on you could see just how awkward his style was. The way he bounced around the cage took the foundation that was laid by the likes of Lyoto Machida to a different level entirely. And when he found his opening, a lazily thrown 1-2 was used as a distraction to mask an expertly timed question mark kick that looped around the side of Stitkin's head. It's the shots you don't see coming that hurt the most, and Stitkin had no idea this was en route. If we're talking about sheer brutality, it doesn't get much better than the opening performance in the UFC account of Pete Williams. Taking on the hulking godfather of ground and pound Mark Coleman, Williams had his opponent totally exhausted before too long, so deprived of energy that he could barely keep his hands up. And once Williams had that amount of time and space to work with, he ensured that he didn't waste it, landing the perfect head kick to stiffen his muscle-bound opponent up. A truly brutal way to announce yourself into the UFC. Remember, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single upload. Mikael Pereira might not be the first name that springs to mind when you think of all-time great debuts, but hear us out. Pereira broke down crying before reaching the octagon, then proceeded to confuse the hell out of the commentary team by doing a whole breakdancing routine in the cage. Was he actually going to gas himself out, physically and emotionally, before his debut with Danny Roberts had even started? Well, as soon as it kicked off, he began fighting like an absolute wild man, dancing, taunting his opponent, and jumping off the cage before scoring an absolutely sensational knockout that no one saw coming. As crazy a debut as the UFC has ever seen. Conor McGregor came into the UFC with some pretty considerable hype behind him, as a two-weight world champion under the Cage Warriors banner and with an entire nation chanting his name. The stage was set for an interesting show when this dynamic southpaw made the walk against Marcus Brimage. It didn't take Conor long at all to find his range here, capitalizing on the informed Brimage's short stature by landing a series of uppercuts that each found their mark. And they were very clearly hurting Brimage as soon as the first one landed clean. When he took to the mic to call on Dana to give him a performance bonus, it became very clear that a star was born, and the rest, as they say, was history. Alistair Overeem was already a renowned veteran of two different sports by the time he stepped into the UFC octagon to take on the great Brock Lesnar. For years, we'd been watching the Reem perfect his craft in Pride, Strikeforce, and even with the huge success in the world of K1 kickboxing. Seeing this version of Overeem finally stepping into the UFC made it clear that a new title threat had landed. And let's be real, he was probably the only man in the sport who was anywhere near as juiced to the gills as the former champ Lesnar was. But even though he might have surrendered a small size advantage to Brock, Overeem's striking skills were way too much for him on fight night. He beat the brakes off of Lesnar in there, making him look completely out of his depth in the stand-up department. A brutal tour de force from this dangerous Dutchman. Expectations were sky high when the UFC announced that Leonard Garcia and Chan Sung Jung would be running back their WEC Classic inside the UFC octagon. The first they shared was one of the craziest back-and-forth wars you will ever see. But while the fans expected to get something similar in the sequel, the Korean Zombie had other plans. He was a fighter who was evolving past his rival Garcia, and after taking Leonard's back in their second fight, he began moving to an odd position that we had not yet seen inside the UFC. Eventually, Joe Rogan was the first to catch it, declaring that Jung was setting up a rare twister submission, a move created by the BJJ pioneer Eddie Bravo. And lo and behold, Garcia would not handle the strain on his body for long before eventually tapping out. It was the first ever twister submission in UFC history, a huge statement for this eventual title changer to make. Yuri Prochazka's UFC debut, like all of his fights, was totally wild, showing the fans exactly what they were in for with this new signing. The fact that Yuri was brought in to take on the number 5 guy in the world for his first ever fight with the UFC tells you everything you need to know about the matchmaker's faith in him. And boy, did he not disappoint. Throwing all caution to the wind immediately against Volkan Ozdemir, setting a pace that saw him take damage and give it out in equal measure. And just as it seemed like Volkan's experience was going to be enough to get it done, Yuri found his second wind, turning up the heat once again, charging to a huge knockout that made him an instant star. But if you thought Yuri's debut was good, then Justin Gaethje managed to do twice as much with a very similar situation. He too was given a top 5 test in his first fight, taking on the in-form Michael Johnson, an opponent who had some of the best hand speed the division had ever known. Gaethje was a brawler, but early on he was forced to eat a considerable amount of damage. But like any great force of attrition, Gaethje's chin and his ability to consistently move forward began to wear Johnson out. By the end of the second round, the momentum had totally shifted. The fans couldn't believe just how tough Gaethje was, and before long, he was breaking Johnson apart for the TKO. Justin managed to win Fight of the Year in his very first fight, and even now, years later, he never slowed down. Finally, we come to the obvious one. The hardcore fans of the sport knew exactly what to expect when Anderson Silva stepped into the octagon for the first time against Chris Leben. But for the rest of the world, seeing this Brazilian master dissect a hard-nosed veteran like Leben so effortlessly was insane. He seemed to land every shot with pinpoint accuracy, mixing up his boxing, his kicks, and his clinch work with a degree of fluidity that simply did not exist in mixed martial arts at that point in time. This was a new level of striking playing out before our very eyes, and as soon as Leben finally hit the canvas in defeat, it became clear that the world of this sport would never be the same again.